you mentioned that experiment that you conducted. That was provocative in nature, and I think by design. Listening to your conversation with Walter Willett, it seemed as if that was something you kind of set out to achieve. I brought you a gift.
No, I'm not eating anything. No.
It's for those listening. It's a sleeve of Oreos. Now, I'm not asking you to open that and eat it, but
I think this was about the serving size I was having per day. Is this 12 cookies? Because it was one sleeve. It was.
I'm not sure. I can't say I'm that familiar.
Yes, this was the exact serving size per day. There you go. Simon's done his homework.
Right. So we're laughing at that because of this study that you conducted. So I think it would be interesting to kind of give people a high level explanation for why you went down this path of running a self-experiment that involved Oreos, what you were trying to achieve.
Let me first answer your question with another question, which is, if I give you a PubMed link to a paper on PubMed by a Harvard PhD and esteemed lipidologist, your last guest, Bill Cromwell, or one of your previous guests, and the title reads, Oreo cookie treatment outperforms high-dose statin therapy in a lean mass hyperresponder, a crossover experiment. What is your reaction? Or what is the reaction, do you think, of the average person reading that?
I'm curious that this has been conducted by people from reputable organizations and people that have been studying, like in Bill Cromwell's case, been studying lipids and heart disease for 30 plus years.
Mm-hmm. So there's curiosity, and then obviously there can be a shock and awe element, or like, is this even real element? What's going on here? Is this a joke? Is somebody trolling me here? And the whole purpose was, to some extent, shock and awe, and to get people to turn their heads with what I call legit bait, because there are studies ongoing, papers that have been published that I think are critically important for people to be talking about, especially clinicians and scientists interested in lipidology, nutrition, metabolism broadly, around this phenotype we're studying and this model we're developing, that I think have so much to teach all of us about general principles of human physiology, lipid metabolism, with a lot that it can teach us, I think, that could benefit the population. And I can substantiate that and unpack it as we go. But what I'm getting to was, I don't think that there has been sufficient discussion around it. I'd even say that there maybe has been suppression of the discussion. And again, that's something that suppression is not a word I use lightly. So one we can dig back into later if you'd like. But I thought to myself, if people don't want to have this discussion, and I want this discussion to happen, what can I do? I'm a 28-year-old PhD scientist and Harvard medical student. I don't have a lot of resources to do a multi-million-dollar trial. All I have is some friends, a little bit of a social media presence, and some creativity. What can I do to force this conversation? Because now I'm getting a little bit impatient for this to happen. And I'm like, all right, let's go, I guess as my generation says, full send, and do something that's going to force the conversation. It's going to turn heads, and it's going to get people talking. And then we can have a conversation. So I envisioned this experiment to boldly test on myself a hypothesis born out of our lipid energy model. And we'll get into why I thought this would work. But basically, I thought I could reverse my hyperlipidemic phenotype. My LDL has run very high. The highest it's ever run is 545.
Can you define phenotype? It's coming up a lot in case someone's hearing that for the first time.
A phenotype is a set of characteristics, I would say, that can be observed in an individual. In this case, it's a constellation of lipid markers, 3 things that co-occur together that we call the lean mass hyperresponder phenotype. I could say the lean mass hyperresponder population, if that's easier. But my goal was to force a conversation around this particular topic, which, in all honesty, is very niche. You pointed out in our conversations previously that this is a rare phenotype. But I don't think rarity makes it any less important. If anything, I think it makes it more important, and it is a niche within lipidology that's now being explored by more and more esteemed people, including Bill Cromwell. Ronald Krauss has been a co-author on a prior publication, Anatol Kantouche, some names you may recognize, but there isn't a lot of discussion about it, and I wanted to amplify the profile so we can have some serious discussion. So I envisioned this experiment where I would try to drop my LDL cholesterol with this exact amount of Oreo cookies per day.
And just to kind of underscore something, that phenotype is a downstream effect that comes with the adoption of a ketogenic diet in a certain individual who is, quote unquote, relatively lean.
Yeah. So typically we have this high LDL, high HDL, low triglyceride phenotype emerge in lean people, insulin sensitive people who go low carb. Very interestingly, it doesn't appear to be that related to, say, saturated fat intake, no known underlying genetics. It tends to occur in, hence the term, lean people. In fact, we now have, if we're going to talk about this N equals 1 Oreo study, I want to juxtapose it and frame it with higher tier data, like a meta-analysis of randomized control trials, a meta-analysis of 41 human RCTs that are consistent with the lipid energy model, showing, for example, that leaner people, the lower your BMI, the higher LDL tends to run on low-carb ketogenic diets, which, if you just take that as an observation, I think that should be fascinating to everybody. Like, if I just erased any background you had and said, okay, if we have a group of people with metabolic syndrome, obesity, and a group of healthy people, and you put them on carbohydrate-restricted diets, which group would you intuit has the, quote, unhealthy response, if we're presuming the jump in LDL is an unhealthy response, the unhealthy population, obesity, metabolic syndrome, or the lean, healthy people?
Yeah, most people would hypothesize it's the unhealthy people with poor metabolic health. But yet what you're saying is you see a more exaggerated response the leaner the individual is, meaning that LDL cholesterol goes up more in lean individuals when you restrict carbohydrates.
Exactly. And this isn't a regression to the mean. It's not like the people that are unhealthy with obesity have a drop in LDL because they, had higher LDL, and the leaner people had lower LDL and they're regressing to the mean. The magnitude of the effect we see is sometimes of the order of magnitude that I just mentioned, with LDL levels jumping to 400 or 500. Like
yours is like high 300s, 400.
Last check was 541.
Okay.
And we can get into what I've done to manage and manipulate, because I have tried medications, different dietary interventions. We can get into my personal bit later. I don't want anybody deriving from my personal choices anything about their health. I want to be very clear about that. But anyway, I just want to point out the magnitude of the response is astronomical, on par with what you can see in, say, homozygous familial hypercholesterolemia, which is a 1 in 1 million genetic disorder. So when we see these levels, or if you communicate to a physician, say a patient has an LDL of like 500, they either think this patient has a very rare genetic condition and should probably either, if they're not adopting lipid-lowering therapy, go, tombstone shopping, or that you're joking. Like, I've actually told, just in the abstract, people who don't know what I do, say attending as a resident at Harvard, about these levels, and they think I'm joking because they've never seen it before in their clinical practice. They're like, he's probably mistaken about this 500 LDL. That can't be real. I will tell you, it is very real.
Or their only experience with it would be in an individual who has a genetic mutation, has had it from birth.
Right. But again, homozygous familial hypercholesterolemia, heterozygous probably wouldn't get you into the mid-550s. It's a 1 in 1 million genetic condition, so most people have not seen it. So this is an extreme and shocking phenotype. Anyway, returning to the Oreo cookie experiment. Because of the underlying physiology that we will get into, I predicted that adding Oreo cookies to my diet, this wasn't a swap out for fat. I was eating my normal ketogenic diet. You can see in the paper the exact table of macros, and I added this Oreo cookie sleeve to my diet for 16 days. And I wanted a comparator. So I thought a fair comparator will be statin therapy. I consulted Bill Cromwell, who decided with me that the strongest, fairest trial will be high-dose, high-intensity Crestor, rosuvastatin, 20 mg, which is as high as my PCP would even allow me to go, and the highest starting dose you can, for 6 weeks. So it was about 2 weeks of Oreo cookie therapy with a 3-month washout, and then 6 weeks of Crestor at 20 milligrams. And this was something I announced a priori on your friend Chris McCaskill, Plant Chompers podcast, because I didn't know how.
A priori meaning you're putting out exactly how you're conducting this study, what you're doing before you're aware of the results.
Right. So I didn't know what the results would be. I was basing my hypothesis based on the lipid energy model, but ready to fail publicly. But I had reason to believe I thought this would work. And just to let people know that I know how to dot my I's and cross my T's, I had Bill Cromwell, a lipidologist with over 30 years experience consulting and as co-author. My PCP was ordering all the labs, which we were getting at least weekly, which were going into my electronic medical record. So I'm not faking this. I can't fake this. And I went to Harvard to get an IRB exemption. Like, I did this all above board.
And how long prior to this study had you been following the ketogenic diet?
Over 4 years.
And had you ever tried a statin before?
I had not tried a statin. I had briefly tried ezetimibe. Okay. But this was my first go at statin. Mm-hmm. So that was the experimental setup. And I was hypothesizing the Oreos would lower my cholesterol. I didn't know how they'd perform compared to the statin, because I think that's a pretty rigorous comparator. And do you want me to reveal the results, or do you want to have the honors?
Well, I think you should. This is your case study.
So in 16 days, the Oreo cookies dropped my LDL cholesterol by 71% from 384 milligrams per deciliter to 111 milligrams per deciliter. An astronomical drop that there is no drug on the planet that tends to have a 71% reduction. And the reason it was 16 days and not the original 14 days was because we were getting lipids weekly. And so day 14 was the 2-week mark and the second lipid draw after the start of the intervention. And the drop was so massive, I think it was down to 140, that my PCP and I were like, and Bill Cromwell, we probably should replicate this. Let's do it in triplicate in the 3 sequential days just to absolutely confirm this isn't a lab error or anything. And even on days 15 and 16, it was still downtrending. I should probably say for context, on a mixed diet, my LDL was 95. So it was downtrending towards what my LDL was on a mixed diet before I started a ketogenic diet.
Right. So that kind of rules out that you had some sort of significant gene mutation.
Yeah. And I've also had exome sequencing and haven't found, there's nothing to suggest that I have a genetic etiology driving my high LDL. Actually, I have my whole VCF file, so I've generally made an offer that if somebody's listening and they want to challenge me to see if I have a certain polymorphism, you can post in the comments of the YouTube video or on X, the RS code for a gene. I can look it up and report back to you, and I'm happy to do that. There is nothing clearly genetic that could be explaining my phenotype. We can get more into permissive genetics and stuff later, but I really think that my phenotype and that of the other lean mass hyperresponders is a metabolic response. And that is consistent with the idea that adding back carbs, and let's say addressing the root cause of what I think the high LDL was, which was an increase in fat fuel trafficking, basically adding back carbs allowed me to drop my LDL cholesterol massively. And just to complete the data story, after the washout, and I tried the Crestor reduced my LDL about as much as you'd expect a statin to do, which is 32.5%. So in about 1/3 the time, the Oreo cookies were twice as potent as high-intensity statin therapy. And even if you want to call that an N=1, that's provocative, that's interesting, and it was predicted by our models and is consistent with other data we have.
What was Bill Cromwell's reactions to all of that?
He has been incredibly open-minded and I think was provoked. A lot of conversations we've had have ended with him in their audio calls, but I imagine a chin-stroking, kind of state. And I think one thing that he stated that I want to echo is what our research to date does show, well beyond the Oreo versus statin, is the incredibly dynamic nature of these lipid changes. Like in 2 weeks that we could change lipids that much is in and of itself interesting. And why that might be, we think it's related to systemic energy trafficking, is similarly interesting. Now, Bill was very helpful, I think, in helping to craft the story and lending credibility. I didn't want to do this alone because I know people would probably scoff at it if it was just a 28-year-old PhD doing it. So I wanted to recruit Bill Cromwell, who is highly esteemed in the field and train people like Thomas Dayspring, who trained Peter Attia. Like, he's very well linked in, and he was an incredibly, open-minded, collaborative person who could bring legitimacy, but also, I think, carry forward the message around this study, which is, look, and I've said this a million times, but I'll say it 1,000,001. This is a metabolic demonstration. I'm not saying anything about LDL, about statins in terms of value, but it's supposed to be provocation. Like I said earlier, what I'm doing here is putting forth an implicit tension, which is we have this bad intervention, eating a freaking sleeve of Oreo cookies above and beyond my normal diet, which I don't think anybody thinks that's a healthy thing to do. And my LDL drops by 71%, which we presume to be a healthy response. So if you have bad intervention, good response, how do you reconcile those things? And I'm not telling you the answer. I'm telling you that is the tension. And within there are questions that I want us to address together as a scientific community.
A couple things I want to kind of
unpack,
double down on and highlight, because I know that in your conversation with Walter Willett, you were concerned would this study and the narrative around it get away from you. So I'm interested in hearing your view on interpretations of it. But you just mentioned there the response. I want to kind of make something clear here to the listener. You're not suggesting that let's say the average person out there who's not one of these rare phenotypes, right, is not a lean mass hyperresponder, but has elevated ApoB. You're not suggesting that person, if they were to add carbohydrates to their diet, would experience that same response that you do, because their underlying metabolic state is very different.
Absolutely not. No, 1,000 times no. So thank you for emphasizing that. And Oreo cookies are not a health food, for anybody who thinks I was trying to make that claim. People make those jokes. You can feel free to contradict me. I haven't actually seen a person that I think is authentically been misled that Oreo cookies are healthy. I think it's so far gone to like farcical and comical that most reasonable human adults won't be misled to that extent. But yes, this is a metabolic demonstration in a very particular phenotype. Lean mass hyperresponders is in the title. I caution it and caveat it in the abstract, in the discussion, and even in the graphical abstract, where there's little warning signs like, this is a metabolic demonstration, not health advice. And so I would hope that most people can at least read the abstract or look at the graphical abstract and figure out this isn't general health advice, and you shouldn't just add any old carb to try to lower your LDL, especially refined carbohydrates. So
the interesting thing in the takeaway here is more that in a certain individual who tends to be lean, when you restrict carbohydrates, LDL cholesterol and ApoB can go up to very high levels.
Yeah.
And when you add carbohydrates back, that comes down dramatically.
Yeah.
Right. Something that hadn't really ever been published on or shown before.
No, actually. People often ask, why didn't I use healthy carbs? And the reason is, well, we did. We've done this multiple times. We have a case series. We have an interventional trial where people are using things like sweet potatoes and fruit and starches. But your listeners probably aren't aware of those because people weren't talking about them. So when people ask, why did I use Oreos? It's because I thought to myself, what is the most provocative food that I can envision? So people will actually talk about this because I actually think that's, the underlying physiology is really important, even clinically. And Oreos seem to fit the bill. So this will work, I think, with any carbohydrate, and has been used by clinicians for therapeutic, effect in lean mass hyperresponders in a medication-sparing way. I just needed to get people to talk about it, or wanted to get people to talk about it. So I decided, sweet potato versus statin doesn't have the ring, doesn't have the zest, doesn't have the punch of Harvard medical student lowers cholesterol with Oreo cookies. Which, I'm not trying to be opaque.
It's not quite the
that
same
was
headline.
The thing that we were trying to get people to talk about. And I'll just add, I know we're probably going to get here, but it's a point I'm really eager to jump at, which is with respect to the response and whether or not this is responsible or unresponsible to do. That's something that, beforehand, I really put a lot of thought into whether or not this would have a net positive or a net negative impact. And I knew that I was playing with social media fire that could potentially get away from me. That's the way I put it to Professor Willett. And so in part for me, this was a social experiment, as we're living in a place and time where there's a collision between academia and the general public, where we're forced to communicate, we as the biomedical community, with the general public. And as scientists, we only ever have so much control over our own narrative. And my platform's not so big that I can really muscle the narrative. So I have to depend on other people to carry it forward. And so I didn't know what the net impact would be. And I, at some degree, took a gamble that it would be positive. Now, I do think it was positive on several levels. The scientific discussion, I think it definitely resonated in the scientific community, and I can give examples of that, and we can get back to that. But I actually want to focus on the clinical first, because that's what people are most concerned about. And I haven't heard of anybody that's actually been eating Oreos more now. In fact, Oreos, which I'm a little salty about, didn't even retweet the paper. So Oreo. Anyway, but that aside, but I have heard from lots of clinicians and patients, now focusing on the clinicians, who are aware of the literature and have done a deep dive into the literature around Oreo versus statin, including things like the meta-RCTs, our theories papers, interventional trials, and because they're aware of the physiology. Now, because of Oreo versus statin, they can apply these principles in their clinical practice with patients who may benefit. So I've had clinicians tell me, because of Oreo versus statin, they're now using therapeutic carbohydrate titration in lean mass hyperresponder patients who don't need ketogenic diets therapeutically per se, or even some that do, and they're able to get a response greater than medication in a medication-sparing manner. And possibly their patient is statin or other medication intolerant, or the patient just doesn't want to take a medication, and they can get to this happy place.
That's dependent on the patient being okay coming out of ketosis.
Right. But there are those cases where patients don't want to take medications. We know there's a lot of information, let's say, information quotes, heavy quotes for those just listening, about statins, and patients are allowed to make their own decisions. So for those patients who don't want to take medications but might be okay adding a sweet potato to their diet per day, if they can get just as big or bigger in effect, and they can end up in a happy place with their clinician and their own medical scenario, because a lot of lean mass hyperresponders are not comfortable with their LDL cholesterol. We can get into that later, but this is something that it's easy to pick out people on the internet who are very extreme and, let's say, certain about their perspective on LDL. But when it happens to you, when it happened to me, when it happened to Dave Feldman, when it's on your health record and you are forced to reconcile with what this could mean for you, most people, I think, take it very seriously. And where there are solutions based in physiology for interventions that aren't that laborious. Like for me, if I didn't use a ketogenic diet therapeutically, would I eat a sweet potato per day? Yeah, I love freaking sweet potatoes. Put a little honey on it, maybe a little goat cheese and figs. It'd be delicious. And I'd lower my LDL cholesterol. So doesn't seem like a major downside. Anyway, point being, I know clinicians that are now, because of Oreo versus statin, aware of the lipid energy model, our other studies, and are using this with clinical efficacy. And I consider that, if anything, a clinical positive, and I haven't really seen any major clinical negatives. And on the scientific side, this really has stimulated conversation and helped us potentially acquire resources in the way of both funds and collaborators to do the studies that I actually want to do. Because if I had millions of dollars to do proper crossover trials, I wouldn't have needed to do this. So I think the net effect has been positive, but I'd be interested to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard. It's hard to kind of fully understand what the net effect is, but I think any conversation around this at an academic level is good. As long as you're trying to kind of temper or control people's enthusiasm and not letting the cart get ahead of the horse.
Yeah, it's interesting because it's like, I don't want to tamper enthusiasm. That was the point. So I need to direct it, but correct the record where appropriate.
Right.
This was about stimulating enthusiasm. And I know that there will be extremists using this for a form of confirmation bias. I mean, if you put the question to me, did you think that people would use this to say X, Y, and Z? I'm not going to play dumb and say I didn't. I knew that would happen. My perspective is these people are making, I don't think it's going to dissuade anybody, say, from taking on lipid-lowering medication or saying something that they were going to say anyway about LDL or statins that might, let's say, go against the mainstream. people are going to try to use this for confirmation bias in multiple directions. And that's just the nature of the beast, which I had to kind of reconcile with before I went ahead and did this. Again, hoping that the net effect would be positive. I think it was, but it's been 3 months, and I'm continuously doing an audit on like, well, what do I really think the impact was? Because for me, like I said, this was in part a social experiment, me exploring what tools I have to play with as someone who is, a young scientist, a clinician in training, and also someone who wants to be a scientific communicator in a time that is really novel. Like, the prior generation, my parents are physicians, they were never interacting with the lay public on social media. This didn't exist. This is a new phenomenon, and there are absolutely growing pains. But my generation is going to need to interact with the general public. And so to figure out how to do that, and also how to compete in a space that is saturated with hyperbole and clickbait, how do you compete in an area where necessarily the scales are tipped against you if you want to communicate nuance? You know what I mean?